Good morning.
Good morning.
How is everyone?
Good.
Good.
Good. How are you doing, Ellie?
Hi, Doreen. How are you? Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Oh my goodness. You look well.
So do you. How are you doing?
We're doing fine, thank God. Yeah, we're just, one day at a time, just like everybody else on this screen, one day at a time, right?
For sure.
We'll get through it.
Yes, we will.
Yeah. Everybody in the family okay?
Everybody's well.
Good.
Yeah.
That's good.
We're actually we're the fortunate ones that we have homes and support system, family.
I
So we
say
have
that
to be
every
thankful.
day.
We have to be thankful for that.
Oh yes, I say that every single day.
Right.
Yeah. A lot of sadness.
I know. Say hi to Arnie.
I sure will. Oh, there's the rabbi. Good morning, Rabbi. He was there for a minute. He's gone now.
The picture moves as more people come on.
Yeah, I see that. Good morning, Marlene Axsmith. Oh,
Where is she?
She's muted.
Oh, there she is.
Yeah, but she's muted, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, there's Bernice. Hi, Bernice. You're muted. No, you're still muted.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Thumbs up if you can hear me. I can't hear you, so the thumbs up helps. Okay, wonderful. I hope everyone's doing okay. Just a reminder that this class is being recorded. And so if you prefer to not have your, because afterwards we're going to put it up online on our website for people who weren't able to be available at this time. So if you prefer not to be seen, you can turn off your video cameras. There's no problem with that. It would help though if your name was actually your name. That it helps me to call on people. So if you know how to change your name and that name that on your screen is not you, that would be helpful. And if you don't know how to change your name, just leave it. We're going to return to the topic that we started a couple of months ago. So we're going to do some review today just to catch everybody up, or to introduce the topic to those who may have missed part 1 of this series. We started this maybe 3 months ago. This question about whether Judaism is tennis or rowing. And the idea behind the metaphor, tennis is an individual sport. You don't care about how anyone else on the team plays. I mean, there are some examples, I guess doubles. It doesn't work for doubles tennis, but singles tennis, you don't really care how anybody else plays. Your interest is only in your own score. Rowing is an example of a sport where it matters how everybody on the boat performs. And if the teammate in front of you is rowing well, then you're happy for him and you're willing to sacrifice for the betterment of the team. And so you have these two examples of sports, which I think also can correspond to two views of Judaism. And it's not really clear which view we ought to be following, which philosophy is correct. We have this idea, you know this, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Bazeh. You've heard that expression before. All Jews are responsible for one another. And that would seem to encourage us to take a view of Judaism that corresponds more to rowing than tennis. Since we're all responsible for each other, the sin of my fellow should matter to me as much as my sin. So how much should I be prepared to sacrifice to stop my friend from doing something that I know is wrong? Now, clearly you can see that this is a subject that can quickly get out of hand. You can start interfering in people's lives in really unwelcome ways. And the question becomes even more serious when we consider the kinds of sins that I might be asked to commit in order to save my friend from committing that same or a worse sin. So in part one of this class, we basically spent the 2 months on two stories from the Talmud. Case law, what you'd call case law. These are two stories of case law where the Talmud makes a ruling or gives different opinions about how the characters in this case ought to be judged. I went ahead this morning and just summarized those cases for you to either refresh your memories or to reintroduce you to these cases if it's been to introduce you to these cases if you missed that first class. So I'm going to share my screen with you now. Thumbs up if you can see the screen in front of you. Okay. Which basically summarizes what we did in 2 months in part one of this series. We have two case law examples. On the left, from Tractate Eruvin. Remember, Tractate is the name of one of the volumes in the Talmud. So the volume of the Talmud called Eruvin gives us the case of a person who leaves the orchard and forgot to ask the owner of the orchard whether the produce that he picked was tithed or not. And remember, it's a biblical level sin to eat produce from the land of Israel that is not tithed. So the Talmud introduces that example, and in the context of it, and as it's having the discussion, it asks the question, what if the owner of the field was a chaver? So that's why you see here on the screen, chaver. A chaver means an ideal Jew. If the owner of the field is a chaver, do we expect that chaver to pre-tithe the produce so that the person who picked from the orchard doesn't have to worry about whether the produce he's eating has been tithed or not? He can eat it and not have to worry about the tithes. That question becomes complicated because there's a rabbinic law called mokef. If you remember when we reviewed mokef, it means you're only allowed to tithe from produce that is nearby. And a chaver is somebody who's trying to live an ideal life, trying to sort of be a good example of a Jew. Would a chaver say, you know what, I don't know where this guy picked his fruit from, and there's no point in tithing if I'm going to tithe from fruit that's in the wrong section of my orchard? If I do that, I'm violating the law of Mokef. So Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says that's what the chaver would do. He would say, no, I'm not going to pre-tithe the produce, because if I did so, it would violate the rabbinic law of Mokef. And you know what? This guy who picked the fruit, tough luck. It's his sin. He took the fruit home. He should have asked me whether I tithed them or not. It's his fault. I didn't do anything wrong. That's a point for tennis. Rabbi, who is the author of the Mishnah, remember he's a very important rabbi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, has a different opinion in that example. He says that a chaver would tithe even from the wrong section of the orchard, because even though that would involve him committing a rabbinic sin, in rabbinic law, you're not allowed to tithe from produce unless it's nearby. He still wouldn't want the guy who picked the fruit, his friend, to violate a biblical level sin by eating produce that is untithed. And so Rabbi's view is for rowing, a point for rowing. A good Jew ought to be willing to violate a rabbinic law to save his friend from violating a biblical law. That's the case we looked at in Tractate Eruvin. I just want to remind everybody before we move on to the next case, Zoom is great in some ways, it's not great in other ways. One of the weaknesses of Zoom is it makes having a conversation with all of you more difficult. The best option we have is to be able to ask questions with the chat button. So you will see at the bottom of your screens a chat button. I think when I stop sharing the screen, you'll be able to see it. Or do you see it now? Can you give me a thumbs up if you see the chat button now? Some of you see it, some of you don't. When I stop sharing the screen, you'll see the chat button, and I'll take a look at it before we end the class and at different points throughout the class so that I can see where maybe I wasn't as clear as I could have been and maybe answer any questions you have. Anyway, that's Tractate Eruvin, the example we looked at, untithed produce. We have a vote in that example for tennis and a vote for rowing, but I told you a few weeks ago, Rabbi's vote counts for more. He's a more important rabbi, so we sort of follow him when he has a disagreement with another sage. So we take that example in Tractate Eruvin to be almost a definitive legal statement. The statement is, a good Jew should be prepared to violate a rabbinic law to save his friend from violating a biblical law. We then looked at another case from Tractate Shabbat. Do we expect a Jew to remove dough from the sides of the oven on Shabbat, which is, a rabbinic prohibition, so as to prevent his friend from violating the biblical prohibition of cooking on Shabbat? I gave you the picture of the oven that they have at the Lafa factories. Those are an ancient kind of oven where you take the dough for the Lafa and you stick it on the side of the oven. Well, that's an ancient kind of oven. And in this example, your roommate wakes up in the morning and sees that you forgot that it was Shabbat and put dough in the side of the oven so that it would bake and you would have fresh bread in the morning. As a good friend, does that roommate take the dough, peel it off the oven, which I remind everyone is a rabbinic level prohibition, to save you, his roommate, from violating the biblical prohibition of cooking on Shabbat, which is what would happen if that dough turned into bread. And the Talmud there gives the answer, no, you don't. We cannot have a Jewish society where everybody is violating laws in order to prevent their friends from violating other laws, even biblical laws. It's a vote for tennis. We all play our own game. Your friend did something stupid, but it ain't your problem. You had nothing to do with it. You don't have to sacrifice to save him. Now, looking at those two cases, we spent several weeks trying to reconcile them. Because in Eruvin, Rabbi, who's the authoritative sage, says, yes, it's rowing. You sacrifice, you commit that rabbinic level violation in order to save your friend. But in the other case, in Tractate Shabbat, it's totally the opposite. You don't take the dough out. So we looked at the ways that the medieval authorities tried to differentiate the two cases, tried to understand, well, why rule one way in one case and one way in the other? And we saw actually 5 different explanations for why these two cases are different from each other. Let's just remind you of what those 5 rationales were. Number 1, in Tractate Shabbat, the friend is not implicated in the sin. In other words, I just walked downstairs and found my roommate did something wrong. I had nothing to do with it. It was totally the other guy's fault. But in Tractate Eruvin, it was my orchard, and quite frankly, because it's my orchard, I'm a party to this unfortunate series of events in a much greater way than I'm a party to those unfortunate events in Shabbat. So since I'm a party in Eruvin, there, as a good Jew, I should violate that rabbinic law since I'm partially responsible. That was one of the ways that the medieval authorities tried to differentiate the two cases. Number 2, in Shabbat, the transgression is already in motion. The dough's already in the oven. It's already starting to bake. At this point, just don't get involved. Versus in Eruvin, where the guy who picked the fruit hasn't eaten the fruit yet. You can still save him from committing a transgression. But in the case of the dough in the oven, it's already happened. It's true, you can save it from fully baking, but the difference between fully baking and partially baking is a very thin line. Number 3, in Shabbat, the person acted with negligence. This roommate who put the dough in the oven on Shabbat was just stupid. Why do I need to commit a rabbinic violation to save my friend? He deserves to pay for what he did. He was stupid. Versus in the other case, in Tractate Eruvin, where it wasn't real stupidity that caused this, that caused the guy to pick the fruit. It was that he should have asked the question. He didn't ask the question, and the answer wasn't provided. You could say that that is a little bit of stupidity, but it's a different level of negligence. Yes, he was negligent in not asking the question of the owner of the field, did you pre-tithe this produce? But he could have also just had the assumption that the owner of the field would have. But there's no assumption that could be made here in the example of the dough in the oven. It was just pure, uh-oh, I forgot it was Shabbat. A total negligent mistake. That was another rationale for why the Shabbat case is treated differently. Number 4, in Shabbat, the transgression can easily be resolved through a sacrifice. Remember that for violating a biblical level sin, like as serious as eating untithed produce, the punishment is karet. Karet means it's bad. It's like the worst punishment you can get in the whole Torah is karet. You're cut off from your people. You're excommunicated. Why? Because you've eaten produce that should have belonged to the temple. It should have belonged, and when you say the temple, that's like saying it should have belonged to God. You ate God's food. That's a serious punishment. So if you're caught eating God's food, you're in deep trouble. Maybe in a situation like that, I should be prepared to violate a rabbinic law. But in the case in Shabbat, the punishment for accidentally, negligently cooking bread on Shabbat is you have to bring a chatat sacrifice. You have to pay for a sacrifice to be brought in the temple. That's the rule for when you violate Shabbat accidentally. Well, quite frankly, today, that's like the same thing as paying a parking ticket, an expensive parking ticket, for some people more expensive than others. But maybe one of the ways of understanding why the Talmud rules differently in these two cases is because the punishment is much harsher in the first example than in the second example. In the first example, you're excommunicated. In the second example, you have to pay a parking ticket. Well, I shouldn't sacrifice to save you from paying a parking ticket. You should pay that parking ticket. You were negligent. My role is not to mix in and get involved and save you. That was the fourth way of understanding how we reconcile these two cases. And the fifth way, this is the one we covered last class, which was, I think, a couple of weeks before Pesach, back in the good old days when we could leave our houses. A key difference between these two cases is that in Tractate Shabbat, the Beit Din is being asked to give a ruling. In Tractate Eruvin, if you remember the story, the rabbis were debating amongst themselves. They were saying, what would a chaver do? What would a good Jew in this situation? Would he pre-tithe? Would he break the law of Mokef? Would he not tithe? It's a debate that they're having amongst themselves. And the key thing is to remember it's a private debate that they're having amongst themselves. And sometimes in a private debate, you can be lenient. In a private debate, you can say, well, you know what? A chaver really should violate a rabbinic law. But imagine if that debate was public. Hear ye, all Jews should be prepared to violate rabbinic laws in order to save their friends from violating other laws. Imagine the chaos that would ensue. You mean I don't have to do this and this and this and this anymore so long as my excuse is I'm going to save somebody else? Well, you could imagine hundreds of different cases where people would come up with reasons to violate Shabbat and make excuses that it was just to save somebody else from violating Shabbat. That's why we rule strictly, perhaps, in the case of Shabbat, because in the case of Shabbat, the dough in the oven, the Beit Din is being asked publicly for a ruling. Should the roommate pick the dough off the oven? Yes or no? And imagine all the ears of the Jewish community listening in for what the Beit Din is going to say. It's a fascinating thing to think about. Rabbis, too, often give lenient rulings privately and strict rulings publicly. Because the consequences of a lenient ruling given to one person are very limited. But the consequences of a lenient ruling that are given publicly, well, they can be infinite. And so in Tractate Shabbat, perhaps the rabbis were being strict. And the reason they were being strict is because they were being asked publicly to give a ruling. And that's what differentiates maybe the most, that's what differentiates the two cases. When all of these questions were coming up about how do you observe Passover in the age of coronavirus, I saw that last example manifested left and right in the Orthodox world. Publicly, you know, women were asking, do I need to go to the mikveh? Remember, observant women go to the mikveh every month after their menstrual cycle. Now, there were a lot of questions about whether a mikveh was a safe place to go, given the warnings that we've heard about gathering together, right? Especially you're sharing a pool of water, doesn't seem very safe. And the Orthodox rabbis were very, very reluctant to give permission to women not to go to the mikveh. And I really didn't see any rabbi say publicly that they don't have to go. But I know that just anecdotally, privately, when they were being asked, Rabbi, I can't go to the mikveh because if I go, I will just be panicked. I have an elderly person in my family. I'm maybe immunocompromised myself. If I go, I'll be panicked by what infections or viruses I might be bringing into my house. Well, then the rabbi would be lenient. So you have to have the courage to go and ask the rabbi a question, and suddenly his views aren't so strict. But publicly, everyone wants to be seen as strict and unbending. It was interesting to see that happen, given that we had just learned about this in what we had been reviewing in this class. One example is a public question. Should I remove the dough in the oven on Shabbat? So the rabbis say, no, do not, because they know the ears of the community are listening in. But when they're discussing in private what a good Jew ought to do, they're more lenient. Yeah, a good Jew would violate a rabbinic law, but we don't want to give them carte blanche, permission to do so in every situation. So that's basically 2 months in, that took about 25 minutes. Everything that we covered in the first half of the class. Let me take a look at some questions. Could you summarize the second tractate? The second tractate, the example, just to remind you all, the second tractate from Shabbat, the two roommates, one left the house early, the second comes downstairs to the kitchen and finds dough in the oven that his first roommate had put there to cook. That first roommate had forgotten that it was Shabbat. That's the case. Which is most important, biblical or rabbinic law? Biblical law, much more important than rabbinic law. And another question, is there a way of printing what is on the screen? Yes, I'll get that to you. But now we're going to turn to part 2. Now the notes for part 2, I did post already to download in the chat section of the of our site. So if you see the second comment after Annette's very nice good morning, everyone, you'll see that I gave a link to a Dropbox site where, and if you click on that or copy paste it into your browser, you can download the notes for today's class and print them out. But even if you can't, don't worry, I'm going to put the notes on the screen for you. I'll make sure you have them. Part 2 of the class starts out with this question. In both examples, Tractate Shabbat and Tractate Eruvin, both examples, we asked, should a person violate a minor commandment in order to prevent his friend from breaking a major commandment? And I sort of took for granted that we would understand the difference between a minor and a major commandment. But the truth is, those terms are very complex and controversial. You know that there used to be a tradition that every day at the Shacharit service, the community would recite the 10 Commandments. Every day they would do it. Maimonides says he stopped the practice. No more reciting the 10 Commandments in the morning. Why? Maimonides was afraid that people would think that there are 613 commandments in the Torah, but these 10 are the ones that really matter. Maimonides was afraid of a hierarchy of mitzvot. He didn't like the idea that a person would rationally say, this law is more important than that law. Now you can see what his concern would be. If he thought, if everyone, it was up to everybody to make up their mind, well, I think the law of milk and meat is more important than the law of pork being a forbidden animal. Well, then it might lead to people having ham and cheese sandwiches because we gave them the right to decide for themselves which ones are more important and which ones are less important. Excuse me, not ham and cheese sandwiches. They would just eat ham sandwiches because they thought that milk and meat was important, so they wouldn't eat ham and cheese, but they would eat just ham. He didn't like that whole idea of giving people the right to make up their minds about which ones are more important than the other. There are 613 mitzvot in the Torah. They are all of equal importance. The only kind of exception to that rule is biblical versus rabbinic mitzvot. And that was Shelley's question. A biblical mitzvah and a rabbinic mitzvah. It is important for us to know the difference between a biblical commandment and a rabbinic level commandment for one important reason. The law in Judaism is sometimes commandments conflict with each other. And when they conflict, the biblical commandment takes priority. One should be strict with a biblical commandment, but one may find many leniencies with rabbinic commandments. This comes up all the time. This recently came up with regards to electricity, the question of electricity on Shabbat and Yom Tov. Is electricity a biblical level prohibition? There are some authorities that say yes, electricity is fire. and fire is prohibited in the Torah. It's a biblical level commandment, and therefore, even in the time of coronavirus, where electricity can be used to connect people on Shabbat and Yom Tov, it should not be used, because one may not be lenient with regards to biblical level commandments in pressing circumstances. Doesn't matter what the pressing circumstances are. One can't be lenient, period. But a rabbinic level prohibition, well, there are many people who say electricity is just rabbinic level, because certainly the Bible says nothing about electricity. So if it's a rabbinic level prohibition, then in a pressing circumstance, in a time of need, maybe there's justification for being lenient. So you see, that's one example of why it's important to know why some mitzvot are more important than others. But today I'm going to complicate this and ask whether there are any cases that we know of in Jewish law where the rabbis said, you know, this law is so important, it actually takes priority even over a biblical law. And therefore, getting back to our question, the question that's motivating this whole class, you should be prepared to violate other mitzvot in order to preserve or help your friend preserve that important law, that crucially important principle. So we're going to spend some time today on a case where I think you'll be fascinated to hear rabbis who are supposed to say, well, all the mitzvot are the same. They've all been given by God. There's 613 mitzvot. They're all equal. Well, there are rabbis who say, well, some mitzvot are more equal than others. There are some that are more important than others. What I love about teaching this class is that through the course of teaching about many different topics, we get to learn about those different topics as well. When I started this class, I think very few of you knew anything about the tithing laws. And the tithing laws this class isn't about the tithing laws. If I called this class Introduction to Tithing in the Mishnah, I don't believe any of you would have signed up. But if you attended those first 2 or 3 lectures, you learned a lot about tithing. We're going to learn today about the law, a bit more of an uncomfortable subject, but some of the laws regarding slavery in the Torah. There's a lot in the Talmud that talks about the law of the Hebrew slave and the non-Hebrew slave. Not a comfortable subject, but I don't think that it's a surprise to many of you, if you've been attending synagogue or know the Torah, to know that the Hebrew Bible does acknowledge slavery as mostly it's used as a way of helping people who are in debt. If they're indebted, they can serve somebody in order to repay that debt. But the rules of how you treat your slave are defined and quite strict. That is, any idea that we have about this process looking like, what we have in our mind about African slavery should be dismissed. This is a different kind of slavery with many, many rules attached to it. And we're going to look at it because I think we gain some insight on our question about tennis and rowing by looking at the question of the Hebrew slave, what his requirements are, and what our requirements are if we're going to have a slave of our own, what our obligations might be. So let's look first at the Torah. I'm going to share my screen. Can you give me thumbs up if you can see the screen in front of you? Thank you. Okay. This is Leviticus chapter 25. It's a lot. I know it's probably small, the writing, but just trust me when I'm just showing you this to show you that I'm not making up what I'm teaching. So in Leviticus, we are given permission in verse 39, right here in verse 39, it's very clear that we may not buy other Israelites as slaves. You're not allowed to buy Israelites as slaves. If thy brother, read brother as like fellow Jew, if thy brother be waxen poor with thee, and sell himself unto thee, thou shalt not make him serve as a, it says here, bond servant. You know why it says bond servant? This is the old JPS translation of the Torah from 1917, and they were so afraid of using the word slave in the translation because of what it might conjure up in people's minds. Oh my God, the Bible permits slavery. So they changed the word to bond servant. The word in Hebrew is aved. Aved means slave. We just read, avadim hayinu befaro b'mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. I never heard anyone say we were bond servants to Pharaoh in Egypt. But in this translation of the text, yes, it says bond servant. So you're not allowed to make him a bond servant, a slave, but he becomes, because remember, he owes you a debt, a hired servant. So what's the difference between a slave and a hired servant? Well, a hired servant is a settler. He shall be with thee, and he shall serve with thee unto the year of Jubilee. Then shall he go out, he and his children with him. He shall return unto his own family, and unto the possession of his fathers shall he return. For they are my servants who I brought from the land of Egypt. They shall not be served as bondsmen. They shall not be slaves. They are only slaves of God. So basically, the Torah says you can't buy another Israelite as a slave, but you're allowed to keep them on basically as long-term salaried work. If a fellow Jew needs a job, you can give him a job. But remember, it has to come to an end when? In the Jubilee year. Every 50 years, there's a Jubilee year. On that year, the Hebrew slave is set free. Now, so far, that sounds pretty tolerant. But what about in verse 44? For thy bondmen and thy bondsmaids, whom thou mayest have, of the nations that are around you, of them shall ye buy bondmen and bondsmaids. So the Torah is here clarifying that those limitations that it placed on the Hebrew slaves, they don't apply to non-Jewish slaves that are acquired from the nations that are around them. Those slaves become the property, your property, of their owners. Not just that, look at verse 46. Ye may make them an inheritance for your children after you to hold for a possession. So the non-Jewish slave, not only is it your property, it becomes part of your will, right? You give them to your children after you die. They're passed on as an inheritance. So the plain meaning of these verses is that you are entitled to keep these slaves forever. Now, there's a word here that's going to become very problematic, and that's why I just want you to pay attention to it. It says in verse 46, ye may make them an inheritance for your children after you. That word may is really important, becomes really important. It asks the question, is the Torah forcing you to keep that slave, or is it giving you a choice to keep your slave? In the English, it's very clear. It's giving you a choice. That word may says it's your choice. If you want to free your slave, free your slave. If you want to keep him, you can keep him. In the Hebrew, it's not so clear. Those who speak Hebrew or can read the Hebrew, v'hitnachaltem otam livnechem acharechem. That means you pass them on to your children. The word may doesn't exist in the Hebrew. It says you pass them on to your children. It doesn't say you have to, but it also doesn't say you have any choice in the matter. Now, the reason why this is important is because we're looking in the sources today for whether a person has an obligation to free his slave, whether he might free his slave, or whether he must free his slave, or cannot, free his slave. Some of you might know there are stories in the Talmud of rabbis freeing their slaves. That gives weight to that English translation that we saw, that adds the word may into the verse. Okay, so let's look at our first source. Enough talking. Now take a look at the notes that you've printed out or the notes that I'm putting now on the screen. Thumbs up if you can see this. Okay. Ellie, would you read this, please, for us?
Sure. A person who is half slave, half free, serves his master half the time, and works for himself half the time, according to Beit Hillel.
Okay, let me stop you there. A person who is half slave, half free, what is that? So let me explain to you how we're supposed to understand this. This would commonly come about if a slave was owned by two people jointly. So let's say I'm sharing this slave with my brother. And I had a good relationship with him, and after a few years of work, I said, go free. My brother's not as nice of a guy. He kept him on as a slave. So this slave who was originally working full time, half the time for me, half the time for my brother, now is half slave, half free. I said him go, my brother did not. So Beit Hillel says he serves his master half the time. He has to still fulfill his obligations to my brother, and the other half of the time he's working for himself, part-time. Keep going, Ellie.
Beit Shammai said to them, you have taken care of his master, but you have not taken care of him.
Now listen very closely here. This is where I need people's attention. You've taken care of his master. What does that mean? That means my brother is going to be happy. Why? Because even though I emancipated him, he's still got to work for my brother. He's got to do all of the work that he was originally doing. So you've taken care of his master, but you haven't taken care of him. This is why I think it's important to understand that the laws of slave of the slave and slavery in the Bible, they look much worse than they really are. Look at how here in the oral law, the rabbis are saying, but that's not fair to him. That's not fair that only half the time he's able to work for himself. Why is that not fair? Go ahead, Ellie.
He cannot marry a female slave because he is half free. He cannot marry a free woman because he is half slave.
So look at what they're concerned about. This slave who is half free, you put him in purgatory. You've given him some sort of in-between status that leaves him in trouble. He can't marry another slave. Why? Because in Jewish law, a slave cannot marry a free person. A free person cannot marry a slave. So this person who's half-half can't marry a female slave, and he can't marry a female free person because he's a half-slave. Should he be celibate? And look at this statement that the Mishnah makes. Go ahead, Ellie.
The world was only created for procreation.
So highlight that if you've printed it out. The world was only created for procreation. Keep going.
Rather, in order to put the world in order, we force his master to free him, and the emancipated man writes the former owner an IOU for half his worth. Beit Hillel changed their minds and ruled like Beit Shammai.
Look at this. So remember how I introduced part 2. Are some rules more important than others? Are some mitzvot more important to others, such that we should be prepared to violate them in order to help somebody else or prevent them from committing an even worse sin? This statement that's made here in the Mishnah, in order to put the world in order, my brother is not going to be happy. What are they going to tell my brother? You've got to free him. You've got to free your slave. And he writes the former owner an IOU. Oh, come on. IOU? What good is that? Nobody pays back an IOU. Beit Hillel changed their minds and ruled according to Beit Shammai. Now, by the way, that never happens. That never happens. Beit Hillel always wins. We should all be focused on this Mishnah for that, just for that very fact. How could it be that Beit Shammai wins an argument? They must be saying something really convincing, really important here. And what do you think that is? What is it that's really important? It is this statement: the world was only created for procreation. Now, some of you might be saying, okay, fine, the world was only created for procreation, but what are you giving up here? What's the trade-off? How does this prove that Judaism is either tennis or rowing? Well, if you believed that the Torah in this verse, look at it on your screen, is actually commanding in verse 46 that you must keep your slave. You are not allowed to set them free. In other words, that word may doesn't exist. You must keep your slave as an inheritance for your children and hold on to them as a possession. He is your slave forever. Forever. Well, If my brother believed that that's what that verse says, is he going to be very happy about letting his slave go? My brother, who we just told you have to release your slave, he's going to flip out. He's going to say, you're asking me to violate a biblical law that says you have to keep your slave forever. I need to give this slave to my children. But what does Mishnah Gittin say? Some things are more important. The world was only created for procreation. To deny a human being the ability to get married, to have a relationship, is like telling him, you don't matter. Your life has no worth. The world may as well not exist for you. Look at that huge statement. Honestly, if all we do today is just focus on this Mishnah, which has to do with a slave. So you're saying to yourself, when would I ever look at this Mishnah? What does it have to do with Judaism? Slavery, it's old-fashioned. But through slavery, we learn an important principle in Judaism. To lay aside all biblical commandments so that a person should enjoy the benefits of marriage. To lay aside all other biblical commandments so a person can have children. Because that's why the world was created. That's a massive statement. Because remember, Maimonides is out there screaming, no law is more important than any other law. And yet the Mishnah, our source of oral law, says, you're wrong. The first commandment in the Torah is what? Pru urevu, be fruitful and multiply. This Mishnah, or I should say Beit Shammai, went up to Beit Hillel and said, if you don't give a person, this is a non-Jewish slave, you would expect the rabbis to say, what do we care about a non-Jewish slave having babies? He's a goy. Oh no. Beit Shammai comes forward and says, we don't care that he's not Jewish. We don't care that he's a slave. God said, be fruitful and multiply. And he didn't say it just to the Jewish people. He said it to everybody. And we believe that the whole world was created so that people can procreate, so that there can be children. And to deny even a Hebrew slave the ability to procreate, a non-Hebrew slave the ability to procreate, it's unimaginable. And it supersedes as a value all other mitzvot in the Torah. All other mitzvot in the Torah, biblical or non-biblical. What a dramatic statement. Take this statement and apply it to so many discussions that we've been having recently in society about the sacrifices we should make for children, right? We make lots of sacrifices for lots of different people, but we're still fighting to make life affordable for families and get Jewish education costs down to reasonable levels. And one of the things that's always fired back is that Jewish day school tuition is the greatest birth control that's ever been invented. when people see what it's going to cost them to have another kid, and it's not just Jewish day school tuition, it's all of the expenses today of having a child. Well, what would Beit Shammai say to that? Beit Shammai would say, excuse me? If you're not encouraging people, giving them the resources they need to procreate, to have kids. And by the way, I have friends that I know personally who choose for financial reasons not to have any kids because it's just too expensive. I can argue with them about what their priorities in life might be, but a lot of them really do have real financial concerns. And it's a critique, I think, that's offered to us as a society. The whole world was created for procreation. You should be prepared to suspend all other laws in order to protect that value. And Beit Hillel said, you know what? You're right. Whoa, Beit Hillel. They win 90% of every argument, but throw procreation in their face and they give up pretty quickly. So I think this is a fascinating, fascinating source to look at that contributes. I think it's a point for rowing, isn't it? Right? For sure, a point for rowing. I got to lose my slave because of my brother, my stupid brother let his slave go. And now I can't put this slave in a bind of making him unable to marry. And therefore, I have to let him go and accept just an IOU note and give him the right to marry and have a family of his own. Because to deny somebody that right is inhuman. It's a denial of the whole Torah. Pru urvu, be fruitful and multiply as a Jewish value takes precedence. And this, my friends, is not about a biblical commandment versus a rabbinic commandment, which is everything we've seen before. This is about a principle enshrined through a mitzvah, a biblical principle that is more important than other biblical principles. I long for a Jewish world where we can start caring about some of those principles more than some of the foolish nuances and specifics of halakha that some rabbis seem to be stuck in, and they're prepared to have us sacrifice many of our principles in order to stand by their little nuance. Look at the courage of Beit Shammai. I love it. The whole world was created for procreation. You let him go. Wow. Let's take a look at how the Jewish sources deal with this problem. Abe, can you read this source over here from?
I'm sorry, the reading is difficult for my eyes.
No problem. Marv, would you be willing to read?
Said Rav Yehuda, said Shmuel, anyone who frees his slave violates a positive biblical commandment. As it says, you shall work them forever.
So now you see the challenge that I was talking about. How you can't free your slave because the Torah says, Le'olam bahem ta'avodu. Le'olam bahem ta'avodu. Remember, right here. I'm looking for it. See it right here in the Hebrew? I just highlighted it. Le'olam bahem ta'avodu. Of them, here's that word may again. You see that may doesn't exist in the Hebrew. Of them may ye take your bondmen forever. That may doesn't exist in the Hebrew. But Shmuel, which is the source that Marv just read for us, says, it doesn't say may, it says you have to. keep them on as your slave. You shall work them forever. So he's clarifying that my brother, who just had to free his slave, we forced him to, is violating a biblical commandment. So let's go to the Tosafot to see how this is resolved. Ellen, would you be able to read for us? Sorry, Marv, you can keep going.
The Mishnah teaches that we force an owner to emancipate half-free, half-slave man so that he can have children, even though we have a tradition in that same chapter of Talmud that emancipating a slave is a failure to fulfill a positive commandment, that is, to maintain Gentile slaves in perpetuity.
Everyone understands that? Right? Tosafot, remember, is that these are the medieval commentators, and they're looking at this example, which says, free the half-slave so that he can have children, and trying to reconcile it with a tradition on the very same page of the Talmud, which says you have to keep your slaves forever. Go ahead, Mark.
Tosafot want to know why the Mishnah thus seems to permit violating one commandment in order to allow someone to perform a mitzvah.
Oh, look at that. The exact question we've been dealing with in this class. How can you permit the violation of a commandment in order to allow this non-Jewish slave to perform a mitzvah? Now, here's the part you have to highlight. Go ahead, Marv.
That case is different because procreation is a great mitzvah. As we see in the case of Rabbi Eliezer, who freed his slave in order to complete a minyan for prayer, where the Talmud justifies this by saying that a mitzvah of the many is different.
Very good. So here we have language that maybe we've never seen before. In the Hebrew, I bolded it, mitzvah rabbah he. It's a mitzvah rabbah. Procreation is a great mitzvah. Maimonides would be freaking out. How dare you take one mitzvah and make it more important than the rest of them?
Yes.
But Tosafot are not so concerned. Tosafot say, no, we actually have precedents in Judaism that some mitzvot are more important than others. And what case do they cite here? A new case that we haven't seen yet. They quote Rabbi Eliezer, who freed his slave in order to complete a minyan for prayer, where the Talmud justifies this by saying that a mitzvah of the many is different. This is an actual case in the Talmud. I didn't include it here to read because it's a very long story in the Talmud, but it is a real story. Rabbi Eliezer got to minyan one day and he brought his slave along with him, non-Jewish slave. And guess how many people were in the chapel that day? 9. Plus the 10th was his non-Jewish slave. So what did he do? Smart guy. I guess he really needed to say Kaddish. He set his slave free and converted him immediately. It's like whenever we were 9 at the minyan, I always threaten our security guard and say, you know, I could convert you right now and then you can join the minyan. They always find that funny. I don't think they understand what's involved. Would not be so funny. How does Rabbi Eliezer justify setting his slave free when we've learned that you have to keep your slave forever? So how do Tosafot understand it? They say, you know what? He's allowed to free his slave because there was a mitzvah at hand, an important mitzvah, a mitzvah of the many. In the Hebrew, it's mitzvah de Rabim. And a mitzvah, why did he free the slave? Because now he just enabled all the people in the minyan can now pray with the minyan. So Rabbi Eliezer did something also that gives Judaism a vote for rowing, not tennis. He let his slave go free, converted him, and the Tosafot say he was entitled to do so and right to do so because mitzvah de rabim shane. He allowed many, many people to do a mitzvah, and that's different. So we have now learned two different stories of biblical level mitzvot that matter more than others. The first, this very powerful text about procreation being more important than anything else. If you're going to sacrifice a mitzvah, maybe you shouldn't be sacrificing it for little things, but to allow somebody to procreate, be prepared to sacrifice. And number two, if you sacrificing your mitzvah can enable a large group, one could use the community, by you freeing your slave, committing a transgression by doing so, you've allowed the whole community to benefit in some way. Well, you can do that too. So this isn't the example of the bread in the oven. The bread in the oven is just two people. It's not the example either of the untithed produce in the orchard. That's also just two people, the owner of the orchard and the one who picked the fruit. Here we have a whole community that's at stake. Their ability to daven together with a minyan is at stake. And Tosafot say, in order to allow that to happen, you can violate a law. And here in the case of the slave, because such an important value is at stake, what Tosafot says is a mitzvah rabbah, a big, big mitzvah, procreation, we should be prepared to violate. I think that's what we're going to do today. Let me just take a look and see our message board if there were any questions. Is there a way of printing what is on the screen? Yes. So on the top of the chat box, you'll see the Dropbox link. Just copy paste that Dropbox link into your browser. And if you see, I sent that message at 9:45. Just copy paste it into your browser and you can print it. If you're having trouble doing so, just send me an email. I'm happy to send you the sources and you can print them out at your home. And the first lecture somebody's asking me about, same thing. Just email me. I'm going to put my email in the chat box, jrgrover@gmail.com. Just email me and I'll happy to send you the notes from the first lecture as well. There are some, Bob says, there are some who would say do not have children because of climate issues. How do we answer those? I was thinking of the same thing. You know, I do have some friends who say, well, we shouldn't have too many children because overpopulation of the earth is a big concern nowadays. That's fair, Bob, but what I would say is there's a big difference between having a limited number of kids and having no kids. And to tell that slave, you are not allowed to procreate at all. That's such a violation to the rabbis, not just of halakha, not just of Torah. It's like you're violating the whole purpose of the world's creation. If there's no people in the world, well, then the world doesn't matter. Then God's creation of the world is useless. That's the difference I think we need to see. And one can have a nuanced discussion on one hand saying, should we not have 100 kids or 20 kids or some ridiculous number of kids versus denying somebody the ability to have any children at all because you say, well, the Torah says I can't let him go free, so tough luck. That's inhuman. Does procreation supersede saving a life? I have to think about that. According to Jewish law, saving a life is of the highest importance, right? So I'd have to think about that, about what situation might be procreation versus saving a life. I think I need a case law to understand the details there. And Marcy, what about the brother who freed the slave? Didn't he break the biblical prohibition and cause the problem that was solved at the expense of his brother? What about a slave who is too old to procreate or has fertility problems? Marcy, you have a very Talmudic mind. That's very, very good. Looking at how, I am sure that at some later point, one of the commentators said, well, this whole thing doesn't apply if the slave is too old to have children, or if he's already married and has children, then it doesn't apply. That's true. And how do we deal with the brother who freed his slave? Well, the brother violated a biblical commandment, just like the guy who baked the bread in the oven, right? So yes, it's my fault that I freed the slave. But now my brother that I was sharing this slave with is stuck with a problem of his own. Yes, it's of my doing. You know, I violated a law, but he's stuck with trying to figure out now how to navigate this situation. And I think it's a very important statement that the Mishnah makes. And something I think that I've been thinking a lot about, I don't know about you all, but so much in the past month has been what takes priority. In my life, what do I want to prioritize? There's so much, we've used the words essential service. Have you guys heard those words being used by many of our leaders? And it's a real question asking us what's essential and what's non-essential. Even in our staff meetings here at the shul, what's essential? What should we be continuing to offer? And what should we, for the safety of everybody, what should we be more prepared to sacrifice? And we shouldn't shy away from that discussion. I think there's a trend now in Judaism to get so involved in the specifics of Jewish law, in the little details, that we miss the bigger picture. And this source, to me, you know, if there's anything we did today, we looked at a source that says, forget about the details. When the ability of a person to have a life of dignity is at stake, throw away your details. Let them go free. Take that principle and apply it to so many different discussions and areas of Jewish law where I think we're more afraid to even have that discussion. What's more important? Janet says, isn't essential subjective? Absolutely. But just because it's subjective, what's an essential worker, what's a non-essential worker, what's a mitzvah rabbah and what's not a mitzvah rabbah, just because it's subjective does not mean we should shy away from thinking about it, from having the conversation. Tosafot were not afraid. The Mishnah was not afraid. They were ready. Maimonides was afraid. But the Mishnah was not. Some mitzvot matter more than others, and we should be ready to sacrifice for them. Okay, there's lots more to say on that subject. We will continue next week. And again, keep safe. That's most important. But if you want to have notes that weren't available or that were not clear, please feel free to email me, jrgrover@gmail.com. My address is in the chat box. This was a lot of fun. I love studying with you all, and I wish you a great, great day. See you all soon.